There is a valley in the south of Greece where the mountains lean inward, as if to keep a secret. The Greeks called it Lacedaemon. Through it runs a river, the Eurotas. And along its banks once lived a people who built no great temples, minted no proud coins, and raised no monuments to their own names. When travelers came searching for their city, they were disappointed. They had expected walls. They had expected towers. They found only villages, scattered among the olive groves. They found a people who said that their walls were not made of stone. We have heard this story told 1,000 times, told always as a story of war, of bronze and blood, of a narrow pass, of shields locked together against an empire. But tonight, we are not here for the war. Maybe most people arrive expecting Thermopylae. The surprising part is how much of Sparta's story begins far away from any battlefield. Tonight, we are here for the silence behind it, for the laws no one ever wrote down, for the kings who spoke to the gods, for the women who held the land while the men held the line, for the meals taken together in the dark, where a single spoken word could never pass back through the door. And one of the most overlooked facts about Sparta is that its women often controlled far more economic life than outsiders expected. We are here for the people who believed that the fewer words a man spoke, the more deeply he understood the world. Tonight, we go looking for the spirit of a people, and for the silent law by which that spirit, in the end, quietly consumed them. This is the story of the Spartans, not as soldiers, but as a tribe. And it begins not with a war, but with a prophet. To understand the Spartans, you must first understand a man who may never have existed at all. His name was Lycurgus. The Greeks themselves could not agree on when he lived. Some placed him 9 centuries before our era, others later. The greatest of their historians simply confess their uncertainty. He left no tomb that could be confirmed, no writings in his own hand, no portrait carved in his own lifetime. He is less a man than a memory. And the Spartans preferred him that way, for he was not remembered as a general, nor a conqueror. He was remembered as something older and stranger, a lawgiver who spoke for the divine, a man who went out from his people, traveled to the edges of the known world, and returned carrying not gold, not weapons, but an idea about how human beings ought to live together. The Spartans understood him not as a politician, but as a prophet, a tribal seer. The story they told was this: their land had fallen into disorder. Wealth gathered in the hands of a few. The poor envied the rich feared the poor, and the bonds that held the people together were fraying like an old rope. Lycurgus, who had a claim to the kingship, refused to mend this disorder with the tools of ordinary men. He did not raise an army. He did not seize power. Instead, he went to Delphi, to the most sacred oracle in all the Greek world, the navel of the earth, the place where the god Apollo was believed to speak through the trembling mouth of a mortal priestess. And there, the legend says, the god gave him an answer. Not a list of statutes, not a code, a pronouncement, a thing spoken, an utterance, a saying. They called it a retra, the great retra, the founding word of a nation, delivered not by ink, but by voice, from the god to the prophet to the people. Consider what that means. Other peoples founded their states on written codes. Far to the east, kings carved their laws into towering slabs of stone. The other Greeks, in time, would inscribe their constitutions on bronze and marble and set them in the marketplace for all to read. But the Spartans, alone, chose something else. Something that could never be touched, never displayed, never stolen, or burned, or buried. The spoken word, held in the heart, breathed rather than read. This was no accident. It was the first and deepest secret of their society. For when Lycurgus was asked why he forbade his people to write their laws down, he is said to have answered that the most important principles of a people's life should be woven into their character, into their habits, their souls. Not trusted to tablets that the eye could read, but the heart could ignore. Think of the wisdom hidden in that refusal. A written law is a thing outside of you. You can consult it or neglect it, argue over its commas, hire clever men to find the gaps between its words. A written law can be forgotten in a drawer, but a law that lives only in the memory of a people, sung to children, embodied in every ritual, that cannot be edited. It can only be lived or betrayed. It becomes not a rule you obey, but a person you are. The Spartans called this order eunomia, good order, a society in right tune with itself. And the genius of their founder was that he made this order invisible. He hid it inside them. A stranger walking through their land would see no law courts, no monuments of legislation, no archives. He would see only people, eating together, training together, moving as one. And he would not realize what he was looking at. He was looking at the Constitution itself, walking around on two legs. The Great Retra, as it was remembered, did three things. The first, it consecrated. It called upon the gods. It bound the political order to the sacred from its very first breath. There was no separation here between the holy and the civic. To be a Spartan was a religious act. The second thing it did was order the powers of the people. It established a council of elders, 28 men of great age, none younger than 60, men who had passed beyond the heat of youth and the hunger of ambition. To these were joined the two kings, making 30 in all. This council would deliberate, would weigh, would propose. And then the matter was carried before the gathered body of citizens, the people themselves, who gave their assent or their refusal. And the third thing the Retra did was the strangest of all. It set a limit upon the people themselves. For a later line was added to the saying, if the people should ever choose a crooked course, the elders and the kings were to set it aside. The voice of the multitude was honored, but it was not made sovereign over wisdom. The young could not simply outvote the old. Here already we see the shape of the Spartan soul, a balance, a tension, held in place, the energy of the many, restrained by the judgment of the few, all of it consecrated to the gods, bound together by a word no one could ever revise, a constitution designed never to change, a frozen melody, a society built quite deliberately to outlast time itself. And for a long while, it did. But Lycurgus was not finished. He had given his people their order. Now he had to defend it against the one enemy he feared more than any army. That enemy was wealth. He had seen what gold and silver did to men, how the love of money set neighbor against neighbor, how it taught a man to measure his brother by the weight of his purse. And he understood with the clarity of a seer that no constitution could survive if its people were free to grow rich and poor in the ordinary way. So he did something no other founder in the ancient world would dare. He abolished money. Not all exchange, a society must trade to live, but gold and silver coin he is said to have outlawed entirely. And in their place, he set a currency of iron. Not merely iron rendered deliberately, mockingly, useless. Great heavy bars of it, so cumbersome that a sum of any size required a cart to move it, and a storehouse to keep it. Imagine the meaning of such money. The iron, the legend says, was dipped while still glowing into vinegar, so it would crack and turn brittle. Fit for nothing else, unable to be reforged. A man might labor his whole life and have nothing to show for it but a room full of worthless metal. No thief would steal it. No foreign merchant would accept it. There was no luxury one could buy with it. And so, in a single stroke, Lycurgus drove out not only money, but everything money summons into a city. The merchant and the moneylender, the goldsmith and the swindler, the beggar at the gate and the miser in his counting house. Gone. Now, we must be careful here. The historians of our own age remind us this picture is part history, part legend. that real Spartans in their later centuries came to hunger after gold as fiercely as anyone. But the story itself is the thing we are chasing. Because whether or not Lycurgus ever truly dipped his iron in vinegar, the Spartans believed that he had. They told the tale to their children. They understood themselves as a people who had chosen poverty on purpose, who had looked at the glittering wealth of other cities and turned their backs. For what is wealth, in the end, but a way of being separate? The rich man does not need his neighbor. He can buy what the tribe once gave him: protection, food, company. He can wall himself off inside his abundance. And the Spartans understood, in the marrow of their philosophy, that a tribe held together by need is the stronger thing. They made themselves poor so that they would have to depend on one another. They burned away the gold so that nothing would stand between a man and his brother. They even had a name for it: the homoioi, the similars, the equals. Not because they were identical, but because they had abolished the difference of wealth. Dressed in the same plain cloak, eating the same plain food, they stood before one another as equals, in a way almost no other people in human history has ever attempted. And then, there remained one final question. How does a prophet ensure his vision is not undone the moment he closes his eyes? The legend gives us its most haunting answer here. When Lycurgus had finished his work, the laws spoken, the council seated, the money turned to useless iron, he gathered his people together one last time. He told them he must journey once more to Delphi to ask the god whether anything yet remained to be changed, and he made them swear a great oath that they would alter nothing, set aside not one of his ordinances, until he returned to them. They swore it. The king swore it. The elders swore it. The whole of the people swore it. And then Lycurgus went away. And he never came back. The stories of how he died differ, but the strangest of them is this: that he reached Delphi, received the god's blessing upon his laws, and then chose to end his own life in a distant land. Deliberately, by refusing all food. You know, if the story is true, it is one of history's most extraordinary acts of political theater. By never returning, Lycurgus transformed a temporary oath into an eternal one, so that even his body would never return home, so that the oath could never be released. He turned his own death into a final law. By never coming back, he made the promise eternal. The Spartans could never change a single ordinance, because the one man who could free them from the oath would never return. He governed them from beyond the horizon, from beyond death itself, for centuries, not with a monument they could topple, but with an absence, a city with no walls of stone. When a foreigner asked where the walls of Sparta stood, a Spartan pointed, not to ramparts, but to the men around him. These, he said, are the walls of Sparta, and every one of them a brick. But here, we have made a mistake. We have spoken, as nearly every account ever spoken, as though this nation were made by its men, as though it was the lawgiver, the kings, the warriors who carried its spirit. We have forgotten who actually held the land, who raised the sons, who owned the fields, who buried the dead and named the newborn into the tribe. To find the true keepers of the ancient spirit, we must leave the council of old men. We must walk down to the river. In every other city of the Greek world, a woman lived in shadow. In Athens, the cradle of philosophy and reasoned speech, she was enclosed. She had her quarters at the back of the house, away from the street, away from the eyes of men who were not her kin. She did not own property. She passed from the guardianship of her father to the guardianship of her husband, as a possession passes from one hand to another. She did not speak in public. The highest praise a man could give her, one of their own great thinkers declared, was that she be spoken of as little as possible, in praise or in blame. And then, there was Sparta. A visitor coming down into the Eurotas Valley would have been astonished by what he saw. Young women out in the open air, their limbs bare to the sun, running, wrestling, hurling the discus and the javelin alongside the young men, grown women moving freely through the villages, speaking their minds without lowering their eyes, managing estates, giving orders, holding the wealth of great households in their own hands. The other Greeks mocked them with a cruel nickname, the thigh flashers, for the short tunics they wore that left their legs free to run. And the visitor would conclude that Sparta was upside down, a place where the women ruled the men. But the Spartans would have told him he understood nothing, that he saw the surface and missed the spirit beneath. For these women were not free in the way we might first imagine. They were not set loose to do as they pleased. They were given a role, sacred and enormous. They were the soil from which the nation grew. And the Spartans understood what their neighbors did not, that a tribe is only as strong as its women. Begin with the land itself. In Sparta, and almost nowhere else in the Greek world, women owned it. Not symbolically, truly, substantially, in their own right. They inherited estates. They held them. They passed them on. Daughters received a share of the family wealth. And where there was no son, a daughter inherited the whole. While the men went to the common meals, the training grounds, and the line, it was the women who remained, the stable center of the household's wealth across the years. So great did this grow that one of the most penetrating philosophers of the ancient world looked at the women of Sparta and concluded they had come to control much of the land. He did not say it in admiration. He said it as a warning, a hidden flaw that would one day bring the whole structure down. We will return to that warning at the very end of our story. For now, simply hold the image. A warrior people, whose fields their women held. This is the first reason we may speak of matriarchs. They were not merely wives and mothers. They were the keepers of the soil itself, and they were raised for it. For the secret the war stories overlook is that Sparta educated its daughters too. Alone among the Greeks, the Spartans believed that girls must be trained, their bodies hardened, their spirits made bold, while the daughters of Athens learned to weave in silence. The daughters of Sparta ran, they raced, they wrestled, they threw the discus and competed openly in trials of strength. And the reasoning was not wildness. It was a philosophy of the body. The Spartans believed that strong children could only come from strong mothers, that a powerful, enduring woman would bear powerful, enduring children. The training of the girl was an investment in a grandchild not yet conceived. Through her body, the strength of the tribe was carried forward into unseen generations, and so the Spartan woman grew up not hidden, but seen, not silenced, but heard. She sang in the great choruses at the festivals before the whole people. And I think this was usually the moment when people realized Sparta wasn't simply raising soldiers. It was shaping an entire society, from boys and girls alike, according to a single vision of what the community should become. We still possess fragments of those songs, full of light and rivalry and tenderness, in which the girls praised one another's beauty as they danced before the assembled tribe. She moved through the world with a directness, a fearless plainness of speech that became famous, and infamous, throughout Greece. That frankness has come down to us, in a remarkable collection, the sayings of the Spartan women, for they were every bit the equals of their men in the art of the cutting word. The most famous of them was a queen named Gorgo. She was the daughter of one king and the wife of another, but she is remembered, not for any battle. She is remembered for her mind. Even as a small child, the tradition says, she gave her father shrewd counsel grown men had missed. And she is remembered above all for a single exchange. A woman from another city once said to her, with a note of envy, that Spartan women were unique in all Greece, for they alone could rule their men. And Gorgo answered her without hesitation. Yes, she said, because we are the only women who give birth to men. Hear what is hidden in that answer. It is not a boast about power. It is a statement of cosmic order, as the Spartans understood it. The men might command on the field and speak in the assembly, but every one of those men had been carried, born, named, and shaped by a woman. The mother stood at the source. She was the gate through which the tribe entered the world. To rule the men, in Gorgo's understanding, was simply to acknowledge the truth, that the men were her creation. This brings us to the most solemn of all the duties laid upon the Spartan woman, and the one in which her power and her burden were bound most tightly. In Sparta, there was a custom regarding the dead. As a rule, the names of the dead were not carved upon their graves. To return to the earth unmarked was the common lot. But there were two exceptions, two kinds of person whose name the tribe would honor in lasting stone. The first was a man who fell in service to the city, who died upholding the line, who gave his body to the bond between citizens. And the second was a woman who died in childbirth. Consider the meaning of that pairing. The Spartans set these two deaths side by side, the man who fell defending the tribe and the woman who fell creating it. And they declared them equal, in honor, in sacrifice. To bring a new Spartan into the world was understood as a battle of its own, a danger faced, a line held, a price sometimes paid in blood and in life. The men held the wall. The women made the people the wall was built to protect and to be built from. And the tribe, in its strange and severe wisdom, honored both. There were rituals, too, rites of passage strange to every other Greek. The marriage rite was the strangest of all. In other cities, a wedding was a festival of veils, of the bride displayed before the whole community. In Sparta, the night a woman married, the tradition tells us, her long hair was cut short. She was dressed in plain garments, more like a man's than a bride's, and she was laid alone in a darkened room. Her husband would come to her not in procession, not in celebration, but quietly, secretly, in the night, slipping away from the common meal where he still lived among the men and returning before dawn. For a time, the marriage was conducted almost entirely in darkness. Scholars have argued for centuries over what this strange rite meant. Some see in it a way of easing the woman out of the world of the maiden. Others see in the secrecy a way of keeping the young husband's heart still tied to his brothers, so that desire would not pull him away too soon. But beneath every reading lies the same truth that runs through all of Spartan life, that even the most intimate human bond was not left to wild desire. It was shaped, ritualized, made to serve the spirit of the people. Love, like everything else in Sparta, belonged not to the two who felt it. It belonged to the tribe that depended on what it would produce. And so we arrive at the deep secret, the secret of the matriarchs of the Eurotas. The war stories leave the women at the margins, waving the men off, mourning them home, handing a son his shield, with the grim command to return carrying it in victory, or carried upon it in death. And that image is not false, but it is terribly incomplete. For to see the Spartan woman only as the soldier's mother is to see her only through the man, to make her, even in her own land, his shadow. But the truth runs the other way. The men of Sparta were defined by the women. It was the woman who held the ancestral land, while the man lived in the barracks. It was the woman who carried the bloodline forward, who bore the next generation, who decided in great measure which households would endure and which would fade, whose body was trained from girlhood to be strong enough to make a strong people, whose name might be remembered in stone when her son's was not, who stood, frank and fearless and unveiled, at the very source of the tribe. The men of Sparta were the wall, but the women were the ground the wall stood upon, and the quarry every stone was cut from. And every evening, as the light failed over that valley, something happened that no foreigner was ever truly permitted to witness. The men left their homes. They left their wives, their estates, their children, and they walked, in the gathering dark, toward small plain buildings, where the same faces waited that had waited the night before. They were going to eat. But it was not about the food. What happened in those rooms was the daily ceremony that held the entire nation together. There is a question we must ask before we step inside this room. Why would a people build an entire civilization around the act of eating dinner together? To us, a shared meal is a small thing, a pleasure, a convenience, a gathering on certain days. But to the Spartans, it was none of these. It was a law, a duty as binding as any vow. Every full citizen belonged to one of these messes, a company of around 15 men, and he was required to dine there, in their company, every single evening of his adult life. Not at home, not with his wife, not alone. There, among the same men, in the same plain room, sharing the same plain food, for decade upon decade, until death. To understand why, we must set aside what our world taught us, and remember what eating together has meant to human beings since the very beginning. Long before there were nations, there were tribes, and the tribe was held together, more than by anything else, by the sharing of food around a common fire. To eat with someone is to trust them. To share your food is to declare that their survival and yours are bound together. The oldest, deepest bond among human beings is forged not in speech, nor in trade, but in breaking bread, in the same circle of firelight. The Spartans understood this, and they built it into the unbreakable core of their society. They took the most ancient act in all of human experience and made it the daily heartbeat of their nation. The food itself was famous for being terrible. It's almost ironic, isn't? The meal wasn't about taste at all, but about the bond. Sometimes the worst food makes the strongest memory. The other Greeks, who loved fine dining, who built their feasts around delicacies and wines, regarded the Spartan mess with a kind of appalled fascination. Its centerpiece became a byword for grim austerity across the whole ancient world. A dark broth, blackish and thick, made from boiled pork, blood, vinegar, and salt. The black broth. To the Spartans, it was the very taste of their identity. To everyone else, it was almost inedible. And there is a story about it. A visitor once came to Sparta, convinced that such terrifying courage must spring from some secret source. He arranged to taste the famous black broth, certain it would reveal their strength. He took a single mouthful and spat it out in disgust, declaring that now, at last, he understood why the Spartans did not fear death. For any man who had to eat this every evening of his life would surely welcome the grave as a relief. It is a joke, but it teaches. The food was meant to be plain, to humble the appetite, to strip away every trace of luxury, to remind each man, as he ate, that he was not here for pleasure. He was here for the bond. The blandness was the point. A people satisfied with the simplest fare could never be corrupted by the promise of a finer one. The black broth was not a meal. It was a discipline you could swallow. But here we reach the deeper structure. The thing that made the common meal not merely a custom, but a sacred mechanism. Every man was required to contribute to it. Each month, he brought his share, a measure of barley, a portion of wine, cheese, figs, and a small sum for the relishes and the meat. This came from his own land, and it was not optional. It was the price of belonging. And here is the cruel and beautiful logic of it. If a man could not contribute, if his fortunes failed, if his land yielded too little, if he could no longer bring his share, then he could no longer dine. And if he could no longer dine in the mess, he was no longer, in the full sense, a Spartan. He fell out of the body of the equals. He became something lesser, one of the diminished, the ones who had been Spartans, and were no longer. There was no charity to carry him. The bond was real, but it had a price, and the price had to be paid by every man, every month, for the whole of his life. Hold this thought close, for it is a quiet thread of doom woven into the very fabric of Spartan brotherhood. and it will return at the end of our story, wearing a darker face. And this is where Sparta begins to reveal its paradox. The same discipline that made the Brotherhood so strong also made it fragile. For now, return to the firelit room. To join one of these messes, a man could not simply pay his way in. He had to be chosen, and chosen without a single objection. The Spartans had a ritual for this, and it is among their strangest. When a young man's name was put forward, each existing member was given a small ball of soft bread. A vessel was passed around the room in the dark, and each man in secret dropped his bread inside. If he approved of the newcomer, he let it fall as it was, round, whole. But if he objected, for any reason, he first pressed the bread flat between his fingers before he let it drop. And the rule was absolute. A single flattened ball. One objection, anonymous, unexplained, requiring no justification, was enough to bar the newcomer forever. The vote had to be unanimous. Every man had to be willing to share his fire with you, or you did not belong there at all. Think of what this meant. To become a full member of Spartan society, you did not need to be rich, or well-born, or favored by the powerful. You needed something harder to win. The genuine acceptance of the men who would live beside you. Who would share with you, depend on you, and trust you for the rest of their days. The mess was not a club you could buy into. It was a family you had to be welcomed into, and a single silent refusal could close the door. And what happened inside, once you were welcomed? You became part of a small society of total trust. These were the men beside whom you would one day stand. But long before that, and far more importantly, these were the men with whom you ate, every night, the whole of your life. You knew their voices in the dark. You knew their moods, their griefs, their families. You grew old together at the same table. The nervous boy who came in as a newcomer became the grizzled elder across from you. 40 years on. Other societies built their bonds through wealth and marriage and faction. The Spartans built theirs through the simplest, most relentless thing imaginable. Presence. Showing up. Every single night. For life. And there was a sacred secrecy to it. As each new member entered for the first time, the eldest man of the mess would gesture toward the door through which he had come, and tell him a single solemn rule, that through that door, no word ever passed. Whatever was spoken at the common table stayed inside the room. It was a confessional, bound by honor. A man could speak his heart at the mess, and know that it would never follow him out into the village. The free fellowship of the table was protected by an absolute vow of silence. In a nation famous for speaking little in public, here was the one place a man could truly speak. Among his brothers, in the dark, under a seal that would never be broken. Even the kings ate here. This is perhaps the most astonishing detail of all. The two kings of Sparta, men descended, as the tribe believed, from a god, did not dine apart. Not in palaces, attended by servants and surrounded by luxury, as kings did everywhere else in the ancient world. They came to the common mess like everyone else. They sat among the men. They ate the same black broth. The king was given a double portion, not so that he might gorge himself, but so that he would have an extra share to honor and bestow upon whichever man he wished to single out. His privilege was not to consume more, but to give more. Even the king's advantage was turned into an instrument of the bond, and there survives a story about this. A king once, after a great public occasion, sent his portion home, rather than eating it at the mess. And the officials of Sparta fined him for it. A king. Fined. For the offense of eating dinner at home, instead of with his brothers at the common table. There could be no clearer sign of how sacred this duty was. Not even royalty stood above the law of the shared meal. To break the circle, even for a single night, even for the highest man in the land, was an offense against the spirit of the whole people. And so we see the second great secret. A people cannot be held together by laws alone, even laws as sacred as the great Retra. Laws are words, and words live in the mind. But a tribe lives in the body, in shared hunger and shared bread, in the warmth of the same fire, night after night, year after year. The more I read about Sparta, the more it seems that its greatest strength wasn't the battlefield alone. It was the quiet discipline of ordinary evenings like these, repeated thousands of times until loyalty became second nature. In the faces you have known since boyhood, and will know until you die. The Spartans understood that the deepest loyalty is not taught. It is fed, built, meal by meal, in the patient accumulation of 10,000 evenings spent at the same table, with the same men. They could have built grand halls and feasted in splendor. Instead, they built plain rooms and ate plain food, and called it the center of their world. When the foreigner asked where the strength of Sparta came from, he looked for it on the training ground and the field of battle. He should have looked here, in the dark plain room, in the black broth. But who stood between this people and their gods? Every tribe needs a bridge to the divine. And in Sparta, the bridge to heaven and the head of the people? In all the long history of human government, there has been nothing quite like the kingship of Sparta. Other nations had one king. Sparta had two, always two. Two royal houses, ruling side by side, century after century. The house of the Agiads and the house of the Eurypontids, neither ever rising above the other, neither ever permitted to swallow the other up. From the earliest reaches of their history to the very twilight of their freedom, Sparta wore a double crown. Why two? The Spartans told a story to explain it. And like all their stories, it begins among heroes. Long ago, when their ancestors first came to claim the valley of the Eurotas, the king who led them was about to name his heir. But his wife had borne him twins, 2 sons, and no one could say with certainty which had been born first. The mother, wishing both her sons to be kings, would not reveal it. And so, in the end, it was decided that both should be kings, and that both their lines should rule together forever after. But the bloodline did not stop at those twins. It ran back further, back into the world of legend, back to the greatest hero the Greeks ever imagined. The kings of Sparta claimed descent from Heracles, the strongest of all mortals, the hero of the 12 labors, the man who wrestled death itself and won, and who at the end of his suffering was taken up among the gods. And Heracles, in the old stories, was himself the son of Zeus, the king of the gods, the wielder of the thunderbolt, the father of gods and men. So the line ran, as the Spartans told it, from Zeus to Heracles. From Heracles, down through the heroes who returned to claim their ancestral lands, to the twin kings, and so to every man who sat upon the double throne of Sparta. This was not, to the Spartans, a pretty fiction. It was the literal foundation of the king's authority. They were not kings because they were the strongest, or the cleverest, or the richest men in the land. They were kings because of their blood, because in their veins ran the inheritance of a god, passed down through an unbroken chain of fathers and sons, across the generations. The ancestral bloodline was everything. It was the thread connecting the living tribe to the divine origin of the world. And because of that blood, the kings were priests, before they were anything else. We must be careful here, for the war stories have taught us to think of the Spartan king as a battlefield commander, a general at the head of the army. And it is true. In time of conflict, one of the kings would lead the men. But that was the lesser part of his office. The greater part was older and deeper. The king was the high priest of the tribe, the one who stood at the altar and made the sacrifices that kept Sparta in right relationship with the heavens. The kings held the priesthoods of the highest gods, of Zeus himself, under his most ancient titles, the Zeus of the heavens, and the Zeus of Lacedaemon. It was the king who offered the great public sacrifices on behalf of all the people. It was through the king that the favor of the gods was sought, and the will of the gods was read. When the people needed to know whether the heavens smiled or frowned, it was at the king's sacrifice that the omens were taken. In the flame, in the entrails, in the signs that the priest-king alone was empowered to lay before the divine, and he held one privilege above all others. The kings were the guardians of the bond between Sparta and the great oracle at Delphi, the same oracle from which Lycurgus himself had received the great retra, at the very founding of the nation. Certain sacred officials, chosen by the kings and dining at the king's own table, were charged with traveling to Delphi to consult the god and bring back his pronouncements. The oracles thus obtained were treasured among the most precious possessions of the state, and the kings were their keepers. The whole spiritual life of the people, its line to the god who had founded it, ran through the kings. So the king was the bridge. He stood at the place where the tribe touched the heavens, descended from a god, priest of the gods, keeper of the god's own words. Through him, the people of the Eurotas were connected to something vast and eternal. He was not merely their ruler. He was their access to the order of the cosmos. And yet, here is the genius and the strangeness of Sparta. This priest-king, this descendant of Heracles, this living bridge to the divine, was hemmed in on every side, watched, constrained, held in check more tightly than perhaps any monarch in the ancient world. For Sparta would not allow even its sacred kings to become tyrants. Each month, a remarkable ceremony took place. The kings, the descendants of a god, exchanged a solemn oath with 5 ordinary citizens, magistrates called the ephors, the overseers, men elected for a single year from among the common body of the people. And the oath went both ways. The king swore to rule by the law, and the ephors swore, on behalf of the whole people, that so long as the kings kept their oath, the city would keep the kingship secure and unshaken. Consider the meaning of that. The sacred kings, the bridge to the heavens, bound themselves every single month to obey the law, and were reminded every single month that their thrones rested on the people's consent. 5 ordinary men, here today and gone within the year, sat in judgment over the descendants of Heracles. They could summon a king. They could fine him. They could, in the gravest cases, put a king on trial for his very life. And Spartan kings were tried, were exiled, were condemned. The divine blood did not place a man beyond the reach of the law. If anything, it bound him more tightly to it. Here we touch one of the deepest secrets. They revered their kings as sacred and refused to let them rule unchecked. They believed the kings descended from a god and fined them for eating at home. They treasured the bloodline as the foundation of the whole order and hedged it about with councils and overseers and oaths, so that no single man, however holy his blood, could ever bend the tribe to his own will. The Spartans wanted a bridge to the gods. They did not want a master. And they built an entire constitution to have the one without ever risking the other. But there was one moment when all the constraints fell away. One moment, and only one, when the king ceased to be a constrained magistrate and became, fully and visibly, the sacred figure he truly was. That moment was his death. In a society that practiced austerity in all things, that buried most of its dead without even a name, the death of a king was different. It was the one occasion on which Sparta abandoned its restraint and gave itself wholly over to grief and ceremony. When a king died, riders went out across the whole land, carrying the news. From every household, from every village of Laconia, mourners were required to come. Men and women together beat their brows and wailed, and cried out that this king had been the best they had ever known. The markets closed. Public business stopped. For days, the whole nation was given over to mourning. And then the king was buried, with rites of a solemnity that no ordinary Spartan would ever receive. Why this single startling exception? Why this one break in a lifetime of austerity? Because the king was not only a man, he was the embodiment of the tribe's connection to the divine and to the past. When a king died, it was not merely a person who had passed. It was a living link in the chain that ran back to Heracles and to Zeus. A strand of the sacred bloodline, snapping. The whole people mourned because the whole people had lost a piece of their bridge to the eternal. And then, with the accession of his heir, the bridge was made whole again. The unbroken line restored. The connection to the gods renewed in a new body, bearing the same ancient blood. This, then, is the third great secret of the Spartan tribe. They were a people who looked on the surface like the hardest and most practical of all the Greeks. Austere, plain-spoken, contemptuous of luxury and display. And yet, at the very heart of their society, stood something profoundly mystical, a double kingship descended from a god. A pair of priest-kings standing at the altar between the living tribe and the powers of heaven. The keepers of the sacred words brought down from the oracle, the unbroken thread connecting a small valley in southern Greece to the very origin of the cosmos. The Spartans did not separate the sacred from the political. They did not build one institution for governing and another for worship. They fused them in their kings. And this is one of the easiest parts of Sparta to misunderstand. Modern societies often separate religion from government. The Spartans rarely saw that distinction. To them, ruling well and honoring the gods were not two responsibilities. They were the same responsibility viewed from different sides. Although these are their beliefs, so that to honor the king was to honor the gods, and to obey the law was to keep faith with the divine order that had founded the world. The bridge between earth and heaven was not a temple. It was a man, two men, of a certain blood, standing at the altar, in plain crimson cloaks, descended from a hero, keeping the oldest promise of the tribe. And every Spartan, looking up at those two figures by the fire, understood that he was not merely a citizen of a city. He was a member of a sacred people, bound by blood and by ritual to something far older than himself. And yet, for all their reverence, for all their kings and their councils and their sacred meals, the thing the Spartans were most famous for was none of these. It was something quieter, something that has outlasted every temple and every throne. It was their silence. And it is time, at last, that we listen to it. Every language in the Western world carries a small fragment of Sparta inside it, and most of the people who use it have no idea that they do. When we call a person laconic, when we describe a reply as terse, a man is sparing with his words, we are speaking the name of a place. Laconia, the land of the Eurotas, the home of the Spartans. So famous was this people for the economy of their speech that their very homeland became, forever after, the word for the art of saying much in little. Of all the monuments a nation might leave behind, the Spartans left this one in our mouths. A single word, meaning the power of the few words. But Laconic speech was not, to them, merely a habit or a regional accent. It was a philosophy, a discipline of the mind, as rigorous as any training of the body. And it rested upon a conviction that ran to the very root of their being. The conviction was this, that the man who thinks the most is the man who speaks the least. To the Spartan way of seeing, speech and thought stood in a kind of opposition. The man who talks endlessly is not displaying his wisdom. He is spending it, scattering it, emptying himself out into the air. He has not learned to hold his thoughts, to weigh them, to keep them within, until they have ripened into something worth saying. He chatters because his mind is unguarded, because his inner life spills out of him, uncontrolled, because he has never mastered the gate of his own mouth. Maybe
Έσφαλα
maybe
πολλάν
that's why
κόνην.
Spartan words carried
Ως
such weight.
διανέλαβον εμαυτόν,
They were spoken
άνεμος
only
τα
after long
ανασπίδα
thought. But the man who has truly learned to think keeps his counsel. He listens. He observes. He turns the matter over in the silence of his own mind. And when at last he speaks, every word lands with the weight of all the words he did not say. The Spartans trained for this from childhood. In the great system that shaped their sons, the boys were taught not only to endure hardship and to obey, but to speak rightly, which, in Sparta, meant to speak little, and to speak well. When a boy was questioned, he was expected to answer pointedly, completely and briefly, to wrap a true and even witty thought into the fewest words, and then to fall silent. A boy who rambled, who explained too much, who could not find the sharp center of his meaning, was corrected. The economy of speech was not left to chance. It was forged, like everything else in Sparta, deliberately, and from the earliest age. And this discipline produced a kind of speech that has never been equaled for its sheer, compressed power. Replies so brief, so perfectly weighted, they could end an argument, deflate a boast, or answer a great threat with a single word. There is a story, perhaps the most famous of all. A powerful king from the north once sent the Spartans a message as his armies gathered. He warned them, in elaborate and menacing terms, of all the destruction he would bring. If he entered their land, he would raze their city, he would scatter their people, he would leave nothing standing. It was a long and terrifying letter, designed to break their will. The Spartans sent back their reply. It was one word, if, because sometimes the strongest answer needs only one word. That single word contained an entire philosophy. It answered the enemy's flood of threats not with threats of its own, not with boasting, but with a quiet, immovable conditional. That turned all his menace back upon the one great uncertainty he had tried to hide inside that little word, if he could enter at all. They did not need 1,000 words. To answer 1,000 words, they needed one, placed with such precision that it said everything and left nothing more to be said. But the art reaches deeper, far deeper than any clever reply to an enemy. The true power of Spartan speech was not about defeating others, it was about mastering oneself. For consider what it takes to hold one's tongue. Every one of us knows the pull to speak, to fill a silence, to defend ourselves, to have the last word, to display what we know, to release the pressure of an unspoken thought. The urge to speak is one of the strongest of all human impulses, and most of us obey it, without even noticing. We speak to be liked. We speak to be right. We speak because the silence makes us uneasy, and the sound of our own voice reassures us. The Spartan trained against all of that. To be laconic was to be the master of one of the deepest human appetites, the hunger to be heard. It was self-control turned inward, applied not to the body's desire for food or comfort, but to the mind's desire to express itself. And in mastering speech, the Spartan believed, a man mastered something close to the very center of himself. The control of the tongue was the visible sign of the control of the whole soul. A man who could hold his words could hold his fear, his anger, his pride, his grief. The discipline of silence was the discipline of selfhood. And there is a thread here, a thread connecting Sparta to the oldest wisdom of the Greek world. Among the 7 sages, the 7 men whom the Greeks remembered as the wisest of their early age, there was a Spartan. A magistrate of Lacedaemon, remembered for the brevity and the depth of his sayings. A man whose counsel was treasured precisely because it was sparing. To this Spartan sage and the tradition he stood for, the Greeks attributed some of the deepest maxims of their whole civilization. Short, unanswerable sayings a person could carry for a lifetime and never exhaust. Know yourself. Nothing in excess. The very form of these sayings is the form of laconic wisdom. Brief, complete, inexhaustible. A whole life's understanding, folded into a handful of words. For this is what the Spartans understood, that our talkative age has forgotten, that the deepest truths cannot be argued into a person with a flood of words. They can only be offered, briefly, and then left, in silence, to do their work. The long speech persuades the surface of the mind. The short saying sinks to the bottom and stays there. The Spartan trusted silence to carry what speech could only disturb. And so silence in Sparta was not emptiness. This is the secret the chattering world has never understood. To us, silence is an absence, an awkward gap, a failure to communicate, a void, to be filled. To the Spartan, silence was a presence. It was full. It was the medium in which thought ripened, and the soul composed itself. A Spartan could sit in silence with another man and feel that something was passing between them, more real than any conversation. The silence was not the failure of speech. It was the achievement beyond speech, the place a person arrives at only after they have mastered the need to fill the air. There is a deep peace in this, and a deep power. The person who does not need to speak cannot be drawn out, cannot be manipulated through their vanity, cannot be made to reveal more than they intend. They stand in their silence like a stone in a river, and the words of others flow around them without moving them. The Spartans armored their bodies in bronze, and they armored their minds in silence, and the second armor was, in many ways, the stronger of the two. A man can be wounded through a gap in his bronze. The man who has mastered his own speech has no gap at all. We should not pretend this was a gentle philosophy, or that it had no cost. A society that prized silence so highly was not a warm or expressive place by our standards. Feelings went unspoken. Tenderness was rationed. The Spartan child learned early that to pour out one's heart was a weakness. That complaint was contemptible, that the proper response to pain was to bear it, without a word. There is something austere, even cold, in this. We should not romanticize it into something it was not. And yet, in an age such as our own, drowning in words, in noise, in the endless compulsion to be heard, there is something in the Spartan discipline that calls out across the centuries with a strange and undeniable authority. They believed that words were precious because they were spent so rarely. They believed that a person's inner life was their own, to be guarded and governed, not poured out for the consumption of others. They believed the mind grows deep in silence, as a root grows deep in darkness, unseen, unspoken, but bearing all the strength of the tree. He who thinks most speaks least. It was not a rule about manners. It was a map of the human soul. This, then, is the fourth great secret, and perhaps the one that reaches most directly toward our own hearts. They built a civilization upon the conviction that the truest things are best held in silence, that the disciplined mind speaks little because it understands much, that to master one's own speech is to master one's own soul, that a single word, rightly placed, can outweigh 1,000. They left us a word, and inside that word, they hid a whole philosophy of the inner life. And now, we come to the end, not the end of a battle, the end of a people. For there is a final secret of Sparta, and it is the darkest of them all. There is a word the Greeks used for what happened to Sparta. It is not a word about defeat in war. It is a word about absence, about a slow, creeping emptiness that no enemy inflicted, and no wall could keep out. The word is Oliganthropia. It means simply the scarcity of men, the shortage of people, the dwindling. And it is the strangest death in all of ancient history. For the Spartans were not slaughtered, they were not driven from their land, not sold into bondage, not wiped out by plague. They simply stopped being able to make enough Spartans, generation by generation. The number of true citizens, the men who could take their place at the common meal and stand in the line of the tribe, grew smaller, and smaller, and smaller still, until one day there were almost none of them left, and the nation that had frozen its laws to last forever found that it had run out of the only thing those laws were meant to protect: its own people. How does a tribe so disciplined, so perfectly built to endure, simply melt away from within? The answer is the most haunting lesson Sparta has to teach us. For the very things that made Sparta strong were the very things that killed it. The strengths and the doom were the same. Return, first, to the common meal, to the sacred table where the bonds of the tribe were forged each evening. Remember the rule we set aside with a warning, that to remain a full Spartan, a man had to contribute his share to the mess every month, and that if he could not, he fell out of the equals. For centuries, this seemed only a noble thing, a guarantee that every citizen pulled his weight, a barrier against the idle and the failed. But hidden inside it was a trap, because the contribution came from a man's land, and land, over the long generations, has a way of gathering. Through inheritance, through marriage, through the slow arithmetic of fortune, the estates of Sparta drifted year by year into fewer and fewer hands. Some families grew rich in land, others, dividing their holdings among heirs or suffering misfortune, grew poor. And the poor man, whose shrinking estate could no longer yield his monthly share, was cast out of the equals, not by malice, but by the pitiless working of the very law that was meant to bind everyone together. Each man who fell was a Spartan, subtracted from the tribe. And there was no path back up. Once you had fallen below the line, you, and your sons after you, were among the diminished, the ones who had been Spartans and were no longer. The proud body of the equals, century by century, leaked its members downward, and the law meant to preserve the brotherhood slowly drained it. Remember, too, the women, the matriarchs of the Eurotas, who held the land in their own right. We spoke of a great philosopher who looked upon those land-holding women, not with admiration, but with foreboding. Now, at last, we may understand his fear. For in a society where wealth was meant to be equal, where the whole point of Lycurgus's design had been to abolish the great differences of riches, the inheritance of land through daughters became an engine of concentration. Estates merged through marriage, fortunes pooled in the hands of a few powerful families and the women who anchored them. The dream of equality could not in the end be frozen. Wealth did what wealth always does. It gathered, it clustered. It rose in some houses and drained from others. And as it gathered, the number of households that could still meet the requirements of full citizenship steadily fell. The Spartans had built their society to resist wealth. They had abolished gold, melted their currency into useless iron, bound themselves to a common table and a common austerity. And still, the slow tide of accumulation crept in beneath all their defenses and hollowed them out from within. They had locked every door against the enemy of riches. The enemy came in, through the floor, and remember, finally, the thing that made all of it possible. The foundation beneath the whole magnificent structure, which we have touched only lightly, because it is the hardest truth of all. The Spartan citizen could live his life of equality and brotherhood, could give himself entirely to the bond of the tribe, only because he did not work his own land. Others worked it for him. A vast subject population, bound to the soil, laboring under Spartan rule, produced the wealth. That freed the equals to be equals. The whole shining edifice of Spartan life rested upon the backs of the unfree. And this, too, was a kind of doom. For a small ruling people, sitting atop a far larger subject population, must live in perpetual vigilance, perpetual fear, perpetual readiness to hold down those who hold them up. The very system that gave the Spartans their freedom also chained them to an endless, exhausting watchfulness. and it made every loss of citizen numbers more dangerous than the last. Because the fewer the masters, the more precarious their grip upon the multitude beneath them. As the equals dwindled, the ground beneath them grew more and more unstable, until the proud and disciplined nation was a thin and shrinking crust over a vast pressure it could no longer safely contain. So count the great strengths of Sparta, the secrets we have uncovered across this long evening, and watch each one turn, at the last, into a cause of death. The unwritten law, frozen against all change by an absent prophet's eternal oath. It meant the Spartans could not reform themselves, when reform was the only thing that might have saved them. They had bound themselves so tightly to the past that they could not bend toward the future. A constitution built never to change, cannot change, even to survive. The sacred common meal, the heart of the brotherhood. It became the gate through which the impoverished fell out of citizenship, one by one, until almost no members remained. The Matriarchs, who held the land and carried the bloodline. Through them, the wealth of the tribe concentrated, and the equality that was Sparta's whole foundation slowly dissolved. So what strikes me most is that Sparta wasn't destroyed because its ideals were weak. It declined because it held so tightly to its greatest strengths that when the world changed, those strengths could no longer change with it. And beneath everything, the system of subjection that freed the Spartans to be Spartans bound them to a fear they could never escape. Every strength, a weakness. Every wall, a trap. The tribe was consumed not by its enemies, but by its own perfection, by its refusal to bend, to change, to forgive a fallen man his poverty, or to open its closed circle to new blood. They had built a society to last forever by making it incapable of becoming anything other than exactly what it was. And when the world changed around them, as the world always does, they could not change with it. They could only dwindle, and remember, and dwindle further still. And so the end, when it came, was not a battle. It was a fading. There came a day, the historians tell us, when the proud nation that had once counted its citizens in the thousands could muster only a few hundred. The equals had become a remnant. And in the centuries that followed, Sparta's independence quietly ended, and the city that had refused all show, all luxury, all display, suffered the strangest fate of all. It became a curiosity, a relic. Travelers came from across the wider world to gaze upon the famous Spartans, and the Spartans, by then, performed their ancient customs for the visitors, staging the old rituals of endurance as a kind of spectacle. A living museum of a way of life that had already, in its essence, passed away. The fierce private discipline that had once been the unwatched soul of a people became a show put on for tourists. The silence that had once expressed a mastered soul became a thing performed for an audience. There could be no sadder ending for the people of the unwritten law and the guarded tongue. To survive at the last, only as a performance of themselves. What, then, are we to make of them? It would be easy, too easy, to take only a warning. To say that here was a people who loved order more than life, who froze themselves against change until change destroyed them. And that is true. It is part of the lesson. A tribe that cannot adapt, however magnificent, will in time be inherited by the earth. But there is something else here, too. Something that has kept the memory of this small valley people alive for thousands of years after their bodies returned to the soil and their ruined messes filled with grass. For the Spartans asked a question every human society must answer, and they answered it with a seriousness and a totality that no people before or since has ever matched. The question was this: what holds us together? What makes a collection of individuals into a tribe? A people with a single soul? And the Spartans answered, not wealth, for we abolished it, not the written word, for we refused it, not the lonely freedom of the individual, for we gave that up gladly. We are held together by the shared meal in the dark, by the bloodline that reaches back to the gods, by the land our women keep, by the silence we hold in common, by the unbreakable oath to a prophet who never returned. They were wrong about much. Their rigidity doomed them. Their cruelty to the unfree poisoned their foundation. Their refusal to change cost them their very existence. We need not, we should not, wish to be them. And yet, they understood something. That our own age, drowning in its words and its riches and its restless individualism, has very nearly forgotten. That a people is not a marketplace, and a citizen is not a customer. That the deepest things that bind human beings to one another cannot be bought, cannot be written down, cannot be spoken aloud. They can only be lived. At the common table, in the shared silence, beneath the same ancient mountains. Among the people you have known since before you could speak, the Spartans vanished. Their valley is empty. The river runs past the cold altars. And no one comes there now to swear the old oaths or eat the black broth in the dark. But the question they asked still stands, unanswered. In the silence they left behind, what holds us together? They gave their whole existence to the answer. And then, like the word at the end of a laconic reply, they fell silent and left the rest to us. They were the people whose walls were men, the people of the unwritten law, the silent nation of the Eurytas. Remember them, not for how they fought. Remember them for how they lived. And in the end, every civilization leaves behind a question. Sparta left us one that's still waiting for an answer.